All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Stacy, and I'm a PhD candidate at UC Berkeley's Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. And today I'll be presenting my dissertation work titled Agricultural Settlement and Structural Change, the Case of Mennonites in Belize. And just flagging here that this work is preliminary. So, most of you in the audience are probably already aware of Mennonite settlements in Belize. However, Belize is not the only country that hosts Mennonite communities. So, more than one quarter of all of the 33 countries in the Latin America and Caribbean region, including Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, Peru, Colombia, Mexico, Bolivia, Paraguay, and of course, Belize are home to Mennonite settlements. And across all of these countries, Mennonite settlements cover 3.9 million hectares of land. Belize, in particular, has the highest share of Mennonite population and Mennonite settlement land cover. They make up about 3% of the population, and they covered about 71% of all the arable land in Belize in 2021, which is by far the highest share of arable land occupied by Mennonite settlements of any other country in the LAC region, as you can see in the graph on the left. In line with this, you may also be familiar with the fact that Mennonite settlements produce large shares of the agricultural commodities in Belize. For example, 95% of all poultry products are produced by Mennonite settlements in Belize. But as you can see from the graph on the left, Belize does stand out as an outlier, but land shares are also very high in both Paraguay and in Bolivia. And some of the larger countries, like Mexico, still have a significant total amount of Mennonite settlement land, but being as it's a nation that's much larger in footprint, the overall share of Mennonite land ownership appears much lower, despite still having a large Mennonite footprint present there. And then in the graph on the right, you can see the time scale of the settlements throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. So on the x-axis, we have the year that the very first Mennonite settlement was established in the nation, and then on the y-axis, we have the most recent year that a new settlement was established. And what we see is that some of these nations had their most recent settlements established as recent as 2020, and this is actually a little bit out of date as the data ends in 2020. But I know for a fact that many of these countries have continued to have settlements established after my data ends in 2020 within the past 5 years. And then some of these nations have had their very first Mennonite settlement established over 100 years ago, like in the case of Mexico, for example. So this is still an ongoing migration that is continuing in the present day, and it is increasingly common across the Latin America and Caribbean region, but Belize is the most notable case of this. So, knowing that Belize is a case where there's been significant Mennonite settlement migration, and that this is also a feature of many other parts of the LAC region, what is the goal of this project and what does it have to do with the Mennonite settlement in Belize? So, the title of this project is Agricultural Settlement and Structural Change. So, what I want to know is the relationship between the agricultural settlement and structural changes, meaning large scale changes to the makeup of the economy, to human activity, to the allocation of resources, and ultimately to welfare. And these are all core parts of the process that we refer to as development. And in order to answer this question, I'm going to investigate the case of Mennonite settlement in Belize as an example of large-scale increases to agricultural settlement. I'm primarily interested in outcomes that we could refer to as the spatial allocation of and the composition of human activity. So by this, I mean, where does human activity happen and what are the activities that are happening? So one way that I can characterize both the spatial allocation and the composition of human activity is to look at land use. So land use is a pretty straightforward way to measure both of these things by simply looking at what is the land use allocation in a given place that tells us where an activity is happening and what the activity is. And it also allows us to pretty easily investigate both potential benefits of development gains, but also potential environmental costs of those human activities. And by accounting for both of these things, I hope to be able to glean the overall effect of the increased allocation of land to agriculture on total welfare. And what I present today is going to primarily concern this third question that's highlighted in red, which is a step along the way to answering the remaining questions. But so today we're going to focus on what is the impact of Mennonite settlement on land use. So just to preview the results, if you don't make it to the end of the presentation, by the end, I should have convinced you that land within settlements, within Mennonite settlements, converted from nature land use to agricultural land use. And land nearby, but outside of Mennonite settlements, also tended to convert from nature to agricultural land use. And third, land use tends to be sticky. What that means is that the current land use allocation tends to be the future land use allocation. And fourth, these are useful facts that we can use to evaluate the welfare impacts of land use change. Okay, so why study Mennonite settlements for this purpose? First, just to clear up some definitions, when I say Mennonite, I'm referring to the ethno-religious group belonging to the Anabaptist sect of Christianity. So these are an ethno-religious peoples of European descent who speak Plattdeutsch, also known as Low German, and they do belong to a particular religious group, Anabaptism. And a couple of key characteristics of Mennonite settlements that make them particularly well suited for studying impacts of agricultural land use are that Mennonite settlements constitute discrete migration events, and Mennonite settlements specialize in agriculture. So, discrete migration events, what I mean by that is that we usually observe an entire community cluster or a contiguous enclave that is established at a particular point in time, as opposed to a steady flow of individual households streaming into the host country or region. So typically, the establishment of a Mennonite community involves a single large land purchase and then the subsequent migration of several households at once that will then make up that community. And secondly, the specialization in agriculture. So Mennonite settlements tend to be very centered around agricultural production, no matter what the current development stage of the host country is. So we have strong reason to believe that whenever a Mennonite settlement is established, there will be a change from the current land use toward agricultural land use, no matter what the previous land use category was. If Mennonite settlement arrives to that location, then it should become agricultural land. These two facts taken together make Mennonite settlement a particularly useful case study for understanding the implications of large-scale increases in agricultural land use. And beyond this, Mennonite settlement presence is also just increasing across the globe. There have been some recent examples of expansion in Peru and in Angola. And Suriname is struck out here because settlement establishment was considered in Suriname, and then it was ultimately ruled out by the government after receiving a lot of concern from the local and the global community. So this is a sort of growing issue, and it highlights the ongoing uncertainty over welfare impacts of agricultural settlements, taking both environmental costs and economic benefits into account. So the economic benefits are something that is attractive to governments who are considering whether or not they should encourage Mennonite agricultural settlements within their nation. And so government-supported agricultural settlement has been a common tactic for growth, not only just through Mennonite settlements, but all kinds of different agricultural settlement schemes. So, just to kind of make this point a little bit more clear, Mennonite settlements do have some unique characteristics that allow us to study the effects of land use change, um, and the phenomenon of large increases in agricultural land use. But this has been very common in other development instances throughout history in other nations. So, there are a few examples here on this slide. The Russian Empire Decree of 1763, the U.S. Homestead Act of 1862. Sri Lanka had several different settlement schemes of this nature. Bolivia had the March to the East, which actually included Mennonite immigrants as well, but also many other immigrant groups. And then there's the Malaysia Felda scheme. And so these are just a few examples of times when governments decided to take it upon themselves to encourage agricultural settlement into a particular geographic area with the intention of boosting agricultural activity in that area. And so Mennonite settlements are just one example of a sort of pretty commonplace type of policy approach, but they do have these particular characteristics that make them useful for studying this sort of in a quasi-experimental way. Okay, so why do these nations want to encourage agricultural settlements in the first place? Creating agricultural settlements has long been thought to encourage development through the process of structural transformation. So, structural transformation is basically the idea that if you become more efficient in agriculture, then you don't need to spend as much time working your farm and you can start doing other things. Those other things lead to development and industrial growth and ultimately urbanization. So there's many ways to go about increasing efficiency in agriculture. Some of these things might be the establishment of irrigation systems, adopting high yield crop varieties, adopting agricultural mechanization, tractors, etc. But one other category here is these migration and settlement attraction policies. So these policies aim to increase the amount of land that's used for agriculture and typically within a particular area so that we can take advantage of economies of scale and agglomeration effects, making a lot of agricultural productivity in one area and then allowing other areas to sort of be used for other purposes. Now, the original theory of structural transformation suggests that agricultural productivity leads to the growth of other industries. But it's also possible that increasing agricultural productivity doesn't necessarily lead the economy to transform toward other sectors, other industries, but it actually could induce the economy to continue growing in agriculture. So you sort of end up with an economy that is centered around agriculture and specialized in agriculture. Now, there are some reasons why you could end up with one or the other outcome. One example could be, say, if trade policy is very important here. So, depending on your trade policy, like if you're a closed economy and you have little or no trade with other economies, increasing your agricultural productivity should lead your labor force to become productive in other areas. But if the global economy is very open and all nations are trading with one another, then every economy will end up producing what they're the most efficient at producing, and then trading with other countries and importing goods that they're less efficient at producing. So if that's the case and you become very productive in agriculture, very efficient in agriculture, then your economy might specialize in agriculture. So when you increase agricultural productivity and when you say encourage agricultural settlement and increase agricultural land use, the outcome is ambiguous because it is possibly the case that this would lead to more urban land use, or it could lead to an overall um, convergence toward agricultural land use. In either case, we do observe some kind of change in land use. And so the goal of this project will be firstly to establish what kind of change to land use occurs when we increase agricultural settlement. Okay, so I discussed why a government might have wanted to encourage this sort of migration, but here are just some additional quotes from a few nations who have had written agreements or statements about their position on these Mennonite settlements. So you can see Mexico. It's a particular wish of the government to favor colonization by the Mennonites, and Paraguay granted the freedom to practice their religion and worship without any restrictions. And in Belize, there was an explicit statement that this was a mutual advantage, and also that the Mennonite settlements were expected to produce food for local consumption and for the export market. So it's kind of plainly spelled out that the government is supporting this policy agenda and aims to utilize Mennonite settlement for the gain of their national interests. Okay, so here's an excerpt from the Constitutional Agreement of 1957 between the government of British Honduras and the Mennonites. So, to my knowledge, this agreement was not overturned after Belize was granted independence, but the current status of this agreement is a little bit fuzzy to me, and I know I've heard some people talk about current cases where there have been disputes between the government and the settlements and what the current state of these rights are. But in 1957, we can see the written agreement that was made. And here in red, I've just highlighted that Mennonite settlements were expected to bring in cash investment into the nation, and they were also, as I mentioned on the last slide, expected to produce food for the local market and the export market. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page in terms of the background, I'll introduce you to the basic framework that I used to characterize and analyze land use change here. So first, I'm going to break land use into three basic categories for this exercise, which are agriculture, nature, and urban land use. We could easily generalize this to include more categories, but these are the three categories that I'm the most interested in. And secondly, I'm going to assume that converting one piece of land to a particular use may induce surrounding pieces of land to convert to another use as well. So the economic reasoning for this might be structural change, say conversion from your current use to urban use um, is is induced by the fact that a nearby plot became more productive in agriculture and people started to move to the urban area. So maybe uh, a nearby plot of land has caused another plot of land to change their use as well. Or perhaps agglomeration effects. So if your neighbors are farming, meaning a nearby plot to you has converted to agriculture, your neighbors are farming, you can now access their tractor. And so now that you have the ability to borrow or rent your neighbor's tractor, maybe you will also decide to pursue agriculture on your nearby plot of land. So converting one plot of land to agriculture may cause other plots of land to convert to another use. Third, each category of land has some direct benefit and cost of using it for that particular use. So these direct benefits could be, for example, in the case of nature, benefits and costs. In the case of nature, a cost could be the actual cost of managing that land. So staff have to go out, they have to clear the land, maintain it, prevent fires, etc. And a benefit could be the benefits garnered by recreational tourism. Agriculture, you have the cost of the labor to work on the land. You have the benefits of the yields produced by that land. In the case of urban, you have the cost of building and maintaining the land, the built up land, and the cost of producing any kind of industrial goods on that land. And then you also have the benefit from selling those industrial goods or from enjoying housing, amenities on that land. And each category also has externalities that are not captured by the market. So, for example, nature supplies ecosystem services, which are broadly the benefits that we get from our nature, such as the production of oxygen, um, habitat needed for diverse wildlife that contribute to the ecosystem, clean water, um, potentially just the enjoyment of seeing the beautiful landscapes, etc. These are things that the ecosystem provides to us that we do not pay for in the market. And in the case of agriculture and urban, I can broadly categorize these externalities as pollution externalities. So, um, the residual warming that we get from the concrete in the concrete jungle, the urban areas, or the pesticides that are running off into the water from the agricultural production, and etc. So these are sort of additional costs and benefits of these types of land uses that are not directly accounted for by doing the market accounting here. So that's the economic framework that I'm using. And here is the data that I'm going to use to analyze. So I first locate Mennonite settlement boundaries on the map using data from Lepolain de Waro et al., a paper from 2021, where they have all the Mennonite settlement boundaries as of 2021 for 228 Mennonite settlements across Latin America and the Caribbean. And 13 of those are in Belize. And I'm restricting to those that are in Belize. I know where they are, I know what year they were established. I then classify the land use in each 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer pixel in Belize at the annual level from 1899 to 2019 using the Hilda Plus dataset. This is the Historic Land Dynamics Assessment dataset. This data set was derived from a combination of multiple satellite-based land cover data and national land use statistics from the FAO, which start in 1961. And these statistics provide national aggregates of land use categories and And then they pair these with remote sensing data sources that cover different time periods and geographic areas. So here is a table that describes the various sources that are taken in for this remote sensing data set. So you can see there are various sources of data from different time periods and place. And these are all taken together to calculate a best guess of what the land use allocation looked like in each year for the entire globe. The data set does have measurement error. It's not perfect, but this should result in a downward bias of the estimates. And I might be able to improve on this in future innovations to the work by including additional data sources that are specific to Belize that may not have been available to the original creators of the data set, but that's for future work. Okay. So here are the original land use categories that the Hilda Plus dataset puts out, and I just recategorized them into these broad bins of urban, agriculture, nature, water, or other. My current analysis doesn't include the water category, but I will likely include that in future iteration of the work. And only something like 0.01% of the data are categorized as other, so I simply exclude that category here. Okay, so for the empirical approach, before we jump into the equation, I just want to draw your attention to the graph here on the right. So this shows for each 1 by 1 pixel in Belize, how many of those pixels were classified as being within a Mennonite settlement in any given year. So you see the first settlements were established in 1958. That's where we see that big jump. And then we have this trickling of additional settlements coming in over time. The first settlements were Spanish Lookout, Blue Creek, and Shipyard. But now we also have Richmond Hill in 1958, which dissolved later. And then we have additional settlements coming in throughout the time series. So we kind of have the majority of our treated cells turning to treated in 1958. So before 1958, they're untreated, and after 1958, they become treated. Okay, so now for the regression equation. So on the left-hand side, I'm predicting our outcome, y, which is the probability of a pixel taking on a particular land use category today at time t, as a function of the stuff on the right-hand side. So on the right-hand side, we have whether the pixel had a Mennonite settlement in it at the current time, whether a pixel was near a Mennonite settlement at the current time, and what the pixel's land use category was the year before the current time. And then I also control for time effects and individual idiosyncrasies, individual fixed effects. And so with the time effects, these are absorbing any changes to the probability of land use categories over time that are affecting all pixels. Like, for example, an agricultural subsidy that the government might have provided to the whole country at some point in the middle of the study period. That would be accounted for by these time effects. And then with the individual effects, these are absorbing any differences in the underlying probability of taking on a particular land use classification that is specific to the individual pixel, where individuals here are pixels. And so, for example, if your geographic location is such that your probability of taking on a particular land use is 0 or 100, at the extremes, that's the kind of thing that would be taken care of by these individual effects. And from this regression, I get an estimate of the direct treatment effect of Mennonite settlement on land use within the settlement and the direct treatment effect of Mennonite settlement on land use nearby the settlement within a particular buffer region around the settlement that I specify. So, what are the effects? Okay, so what we see here is that after the establishment of a Mennonite settlement, a pixel is zero point 0.3 percentage points more likely to be used for agriculture, and that's directly paired with a zero point 0.3 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of being used for nature. So that's what we're seeing here in the first row. We also see that there's a zero point 0.1 percentage point increase in the likelihood of land being used for agriculture in pixels that are within a 25-kilometer buffer zone around a settlement, and an analogous zero point 0.1 percentage point decrease in the likelihood of land being used for nature. That's in our second row. I'm showing the chosen buffer zone here of 25 kilometers, but I just want to point out that I've run the same regression for a series of different buffer zones, including 5 kilometers, 10 kilometers, 20 kilometers, 25, and 30. And they all yield a significant and positive spillover effect on agricultural land use, with the analogous negative spillover effect on natural land use. So it's probably not surprising that within the agricultural settlements, there's an increase in agricultural land use, right? We have expected this because it's a Mennonite settlement, and I've told you that Mennonite settlements tend to be used for agriculture. So this is essentially just confirming that we do essentially see that your land use before a Mennonite settlement popped up converts to agriculture. And we also are confirming here that this tends to be traded off against previously existing nature. So land that was used for nature in the past is now becoming land that's used for agriculture. And what's more, we're seeing that this effect goes far beyond the agricultural settlement itself. It goes into the surrounding areas, which are also converting away from nature and toward agriculture. And then just another point here is that we can also see that each land use category is its own best predictor of future land use in that category. So if you look along the diagonal, you can see that if a pixel was agricultural, nature, or urban land use in the last period, then there is a 97 to 98% probability that it will still be that same land use in the following period. Okay. So just digging into this a little bit more, I went ahead and looked at the performance of these predictions over space. So I calculated the root mean squared error of these predictions and plotted it on the map. And we're seeing this spatial clustering in the performance of the model and the resulting error. So not only this, but we're also seeing that the spatial relationship in the performance of the model differs by which land use classification we are looking at. So seeing that there's a lot of error clustered around some areas where we may have expected to see a lot of these changes from structural transformation or urbanization. For example, here in the Belize City area, we're seeing a larger error. There might be something going on here with the spatial heterogeneity here in the error. So one reason why this could be is due to general equilibrium effects going on in the background that are not captured by this model. So what actually happens when agricultural land use increases? We see food prices changing, labor demand changing, wages changing, land costs are changing, agricultural capital prices are changing, the location that people are choosing to live and work is changing. Many things are changing, or would be expected to change as a result of increases to agricultural land use caused by agricultural settlements popping up. All of these changes cause a feedback loop or a domino effect of changes. The whole market may re-equilibrate, and these changes are not then exactly captured by my model because they're not a direct result of the Mennonite settlement that is what is being captured in that model. They would be an indirect result of this domino effect, which we refer to as a general equilibrium effect. So in order to properly capture these effects, I do need to do a lot more work. So the next steps on this project would be to build a spatial general equilibrium model that would consider the effects on prices and wages and the resulting movement of people across space to capture these feedback loop effects. This model should include a framework through which to characterize overall welfare, considering both environmental and socioeconomic factors. And then I should be able to not only see what occurs, but what are the costs and benefits of these changes to welfare. And ultimately, this would allow me to explore the implications of different policy approaches, like carbon credits, land use regulations, subsidies, taxes, doing nothing at all. And also, of course, doing an agricultural settlement scheme. So there would be a framework in this model in which we would be able to play out different policy scenarios and evaluate them. Um, and that's kind of the next phase of this project where I'm headed. So, just to conclude and wrap up, what I showed you today is that agricultural settlement is one approach that is used by governments in the process of um, seeking development gains. And agricultural settlement leads to increased land use within agricultural settlements, but also in nearby areas. And finally, the welfare implications of this are not well understood currently, and there's something that we may be able to glean from future innovations on this work. Okay, so thank you very much for your time and attention. And if you have any follow-up questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to email me here at estacy@berkeley.edu. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elena, for that. Very, very captivating. And clearly, you've raised quite a few issues that I'm sure that there are going to be comments and questions about. Before that, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Dylan Vernon, the Executive Director of BelPri UB. And Elena is actually in Belize right now. I didn't mention that either, as part of her research. And also, she's speaking to us from the UB campus in Belmopan. What we'll do now is for just a couple of minutes, ask the policy analyst of BelPri, Mr. Devon Paulino, who himself is doing a PhD currently at that intersects trade and development, industrial policy. And so I've asked him to take a look, a first stab at sharing some reaction and maybe a question. And then after this, please raise your hands or type in chat if you have any comments or questions for Elena. Devon, if you can go ahead.
Thank you, Doc. Ms. Stacy, excellent presentation. And I'm glad that, research of this nature is being undertaken. I'm glad that the presentation effectively frames Mennonite settlements as a form of government, encourage agriculture, migration, and you provided that valuable historical insight and the comparative context as well, to show that it's not only the Mennonites that these agricultural settlements. I'm also particularly glad that you decided to do it in Belize, especially because of the key role that the Mennonites play. You showed that it's 70% or more than 70% of the arable land, 95% of chicken production. And so, these are key statistics that, we need in order to make proper policy decisions. And I like that you also articulated your next steps, in this entire process. I do know that there are key policy implications as well, as it relates to land use policy, rural development, agricultural planning, in not only in Belize, but for other regions. Um, I, if I may, I want to ask one question, or to give the audience a chance to, ask questions of their own. Um, I noticed you mentioned that Peru halted their decision to admit agricultural settlement as a part of their policy strategy. But I wanted to know through your reading, through your literature review, I know you mentioned government motivation and, of course, the link between agricultural settlements and development. But in the literature, did you see any evidence of governments engaging in research before making that decision to allow these agricultural settlements? So that's what I wanted to know. And because I know that a decision of this nature. Of course, there's literature, general literature out there on the links between, the agricultural settlement and, development. But is there any indication that governments are actually leading the research in this era to make that important decision? So that's my question there. Thanks.
Elena? Yeah.
I lost my mouse there. Um, yeah, so that's a great question. I know, a lot of this research that I had pointed out, maybe I can get back to my screen here. So so this research here is kind of this initial wave of research was carried out by economists in the 40s and the 50s and is kind of frequently pointed to as where this theory of structural transformation was initially pushed and I would guess that is kind of the of that time period, the common understanding in policy. And so I'm not aware of whether, national governments themselves carried out their own research, but this was sort of the research that was existing and available at the time. And then, of course, it sort of changed in the 90s and the early 2000s. There was this kind of caveating about, well, it might actually sort of pigeonhole the economy into agriculture, which may not be what the government is going for in all cases. And in the case of Suriname, it was Suriname, by the way, that in the case of Suriname, I think that most of this was sort of after the population and the media and sort of outcry and controversy kind of occurred. Although the government was planning to do this as a pilot, and I believe that they were going to attempt to essentially do that as a research, as a sort of research project in some way, where they are going to compare the agricultural settlement option to the carbon credits option. Because in the case of Suriname, they're one of the most forested countries in the world. And I believe one of the few carbon negative countries in the world. And so they were not taking the decision lightly to cut down any of their forests. And we're going to, I think, make the attempt to try to compare that against the option of monetizing their forest cover instead as an alternative to stimulate the economy.
Thank you, Elena. As I don't see any hands up yet, but a comment and maybe a couple of questions from me. The 1957 Constitutional Agreement, I think while it had constitutional in its title, it was never a part of the Constitution. So it didn't make, it certainly was not in the 1964 Constitution or any Constitution since. So it is at that level of I suppose, an agreement that actually became an act of parliament eventually. Um, so that is actually an interesting sort of, it raises some questions as to, yeah, where is that agreement at now? There have been new agreements, and I know, for example, there was an agreement signed between the government and some religious groups recently. I think it was 2023, and the Mennonites were included as one of those groups, the religious one of the religious groups for the Mennonites. My question is, you've laid out, I think, very well the overarching picture of the issues that could affect Belize when it comes to the Mennonite settlement, both positively and perhaps negatively. And I think that is, from my point of view, the sort of understanding that a lot of Belizeans have, that yeah, there's a lot of good coming from the Mennonite settlement in terms of food supply, furniture, but there are also some concerns about things like land degradation, environmental damage, and that kind of thing. Could you speak a bit more of the side that so many environmentalists are concerned about? What environmental impact have you seen in your research on nature, as I think you put it in terms of one of your categories so far? And anything else you can add to that?
Yeah, so in my quantitative analysis, I think what I've shown you is as far as I've taken it at this point. Anecdotally, things that I am definitely seeing as something that should be included in the modeling part of it, in terms of what those costs might be, are some of the things that I mentioned, like overall temperature change. And so many of you might have heard of kind of the savanna tipping point in the Amazon that we might reach very soon. So if you reach a certain level of deforestation, then the whole ecosystem can turn into a savanna. And of course, that comes along with hotter temperatures, less water, less precipitation, and all of those things. And this also comes with less biodiversity and all of the ecosystem services that we get from that biodiversity. And so you start getting into things like even lower agricultural yields and lower agricultural performance, and sort of more vulnerability of crops, less climate resilience, and those kinds of things. So it is kind of a Pandora's box. Once you get in there, there's just all of these things to consider. And I think that's going to be one of my big challenges with the welfare modeling, is how to really do a comprehensive accounting of all of these domino effects that occur with the ecosystem changes.
Looking forward to that, especially for BelPri, the policy implications. We have three hands up. I'll take all three in succession. Christopher DeShiel, Lee McLaughlin, and Emery Ford. If you could all ask your questions. Go ahead, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Found that fascinating. I wanted to just comment on, I have a question about the category. So we have Mennonites, defined as this ethno-religious group, but I know that there's some variation in the religious practices of the various Mennonite sects or groups in Belize that might have implications for, their agricultural practice. There's some groups that would be opposed to, say, employing mechanized farming, for instance, over others on religious grounds. And I wanted to link this. The question is, whether that kind of variation or differentiation plays any part in the analysis that you have here. regard to that category. And I wanted to link this question also to the comment or the question that you posed about the role in the Constitution that Dylan also elaborated on, because I was a member of the Constitution Commission that did meet with Mennonite communities as part of a education outreach process. And that was quite an enlightening and interesting experience, engaging with these communities. Whereas, and this agreement that Belize had signed, the George Price, with the Mennonite communities did indeed come into the conversation, which some communities pointing to that agreement and some of the promises contained in that document as regard to current issues facing the communities. What was interesting was that the communities did display different religious sensibilities, whereas some groups might be sort of indistinguishable from other businesses in their orientation, what they do and practice agriculturally, whereas others would kind of separate themselves and say that no, we are more conservative in these kind of religious sensibilities, and we would shun the use of certain agricultural practices on these kinds of grounds. And those kinds of conversations were quite interesting to hear as part of that whole constitutional discussion. So I wanted to just highlight that example and pose that question. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Lee?
Yeah, thanks. A great presentation. I am interested in where you take this in terms of welfare, because, well, that 71% figure was pretty remarkable. And I think that kind of frames the question that I want to ask, which is about whether I think food security seems to be less profitable than export markets. And I know a lot of people talk about the food security function of the Mennonite agriculture in Belize, but if export markets are indeed more profitable, and that is the driving motivation in choice of production, what would be the implications of something like that on welfare? So I think that's a worthy trend to kind of keep an eye on. Because if there's only 29% of arable land remaining, then is that enough to support food security for the nation? If that Mennonite choice is then to serve export markets, which seems to be heavily facilitated by government as well. So some thoughts on that would be great. Thanks.
Thanks, Lee. Mr. Emery Ford from the Central Bank of Belize.
Hi, good morning, and thanks for the opportunity. First, I want to congratulate Stacy on the job well done in making the presentation and reaching this stage of her career. I wish you every bit of success in going through the process and clinching on to that PhD. So I think I'm a fan of your work already. I think it's good work. I like to see the incorporation of spatial econometrics along with production factors is I think it's a good use of this type of econometrics work. I had a few questions about the information that you had presented. First, you had on one of your slides a description of open economy, and in the description, one characteristic was an unstable currency. Wasn't too sure why that was there. So my question is if you could just explain why that was listed as a characteristic of open economy. My next question is related to the welfare implications that you spoke about towards the end of your presentation, which is derived from the feedback loop of the spatial regressions. I was wondering, I don't know if I missed it, how you had intended to draw out the welfare implications from this model, or whether it was that you had intended to use a different set of general equilibrium models to draw out the welfare implications. I wasn't too sure if it was the same spatial regression technique or you were going to use another technique within that sphere to draw out the welfare implications. And then the third and last question I had was related to the actual modeling, in which I wasn't too sure if there was any time scale dimension that was used within the model. And I thought that that may have varied impact on the results. So if you could just talk a little bit about using any variable to account for time within the modeling. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, over back to Elena. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So the first question was about the variation in the religious practices of the different groups. So yeah, in terms of that variation, so when I point out that the a lot of the pixels that we have treated came in that from that first wave in 1958. Those are the largest Mennonite settlements. And so a lot of the effect is, I expect, being driven by those settlements in particular. And those are going to be Blue Creek, Shipyard, Spanish Lookout, right? And I haven't had a chance to get up to Blue Creek or Shipyard, but I kind of have a sense that these are all three of these are kind of relatively productive in terms of using mechanization and things like that. And then you have the smaller settlements that are not doing so as frequently. And my expectation is that those would have smaller effects. But one thing that I haven't done yet, which I hope to do, is to simply just break them out and redo the analysis for each one and see what the heterogeneity is there in the results. And that'll be a very sensible thing that I can do in the next steps. Hope that answers your question. And then the next question was about welfare and sort of incentives of the agricultural industry to be more oriented towards exports as opposed to local food consumption. That's a great point, and I haven't really thought about that in particular. And that's something that I could certainly put into the model when modeling out the behavior of what an agricultural firm would choose to do, kind of allowing for that difference in profits and incentives that they might face between allocating some of their goods or yields, because even the good itself, I guess, they might choose differently. So there's cash crops, and then there's kind of like consumption, local consumption crops, and those can even be different. So yeah, that's a great point. And I'll note that down for sure when I get to the modeling stage to think about that. And then so the next few questions. So the question about unstable currency. Why did I mention that in open economies? So I certainly don't work at a central bank. So I think that for sure you can probably help me out with this and understanding it better. But one thing that I found when I was just reading about this is that for very, very open economies that have import dependence, I guess, if there's import dependence, so if you're specializing in one particular set of goods and then you're dependent on the global market for a bunch of other goods that are actually necessities, then it could cause the currency to be unstable because you're more exposed to global price shocks. That was kind of what I was trying to capture there. But I will say that that's definitely not my expertise, and I would, I would love to learn more about that, and hear your thoughts on it. And then secondly, so with the feedback loops and the model. So what I intend to do, so what I have so far is sort of empirical reduced form regression estimates. And I'm just using a sort of two-way fixed effects econometric model. Now, what I want to do for the general equilibrium model is sort of write out a social planner's problem or a social welfare function. So thinking about all of the different parts of the economy, which would include the consumer side and the producer side, and also the costs and benefits for the consumers and the producers, but also the externalities. And so kind of going into an environmental economics framework where I'm going to write out that social welfare function and solve for the equilibrium of that function. And what I imagine doing is kind of getting some price data for agricultural commodities in the time periods, before and after the settlements were established, so that I can actually get a sense of what is the underlying change to the prices. And then that can get plugged into the social welfare function and give an estimate of welfare. And other inputs might be wages or rents. So if I can get data on those things, then those would be inputs into the model that where I can start to tinker around with general equilibrium effects. And then thirdly, you mentioned the controlling for time. So I do this in my two-way fixed effects model here. I do have year fixed effects and individual fixed effects. So just to control for anything that might have affected all pixels over time or in a particular time period. That could be shocks like, for example, a government subsidy that went out to everyone in a particular year or something like that. So that should be absorbed here in the empirical model. And I haven't quite gotten to the point where I'm thinking about how that would come into my theoretical general equilibrium model. But would welcome any thoughts on that as well.
Thank you, Elena. There's a question in chat that I will read out. It's from Sean. Many thanks for the very interesting presentation. Very important work. I have two questions. First, from a policy transfer perspective, has your work uncovered any evidence of policy mobilization processes and trends related to monocrop agricultural practices and to agricultural policy lobbying undertaken by the Mennonite communities, both within the various countries you've mentioned, but also from the diasporic links with Canada, which is where many of the Belize Mennonite settlers, as you said, come from. So that's the first question. The second is, you're seeing it now? The question, okay. Yeah, the second question, which I'll read out, it says, from a methodological perspective, any thoughts on what are the advantages and disadvantages of using a largely positivist and quantitative geospatial methodology in contrast to a qualitative approach, or using mixed methods? So yeah, like key informant interviews, etc. So I'll leave you to respond to those. Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of policy mobilization and processes and trends on monocrop agricultural practices and lobbying. So I have not uncovered any any quantitative analytical evidence on that. I have come across things of that nature in my reading and just kind of observing. And I'll point you to actually Ben Knobs-Thiessen's work. Is Ben, are you here? A great paper on that is Cheese is Culture, Soy is Commodity by Ben Knobs-Thiessen. And some of his other works, I think you might enjoy reading to kind of get some senses of this from a lot of the historical evidence that he has put together. And then secondly, so this kind of ties into my answer to your first question, is the methodological perspective, right? So I am an agricultural economist, and in our field, quantitative work is just tends to be the tools that we're trained in using, and certainly, doing key informant interviews would be a big part of field work, and most of the time, those kinds of interviews would simply be something that I might discuss in a presentation as anecdotal evidence, but I'm kind of going to separate that from what I can actually say is a causal chain through my quantitative statistical analysis. So I think that the advantage of using the kind of quantitative and geospatial methodology here is that it does allow us to be quite confident about when we're able to establish causality. And I think that, qualitative approaches can be very complementary for understanding that, and kind of getting a sense of the why behind some of those things. But I haven't yet done much of that, but that's partially why I've been here, to just glean that myself and talk to people and see what's really going on the ground and really enrich my understanding of what's going on. But I am a quantitative economist at the end of the day. Yeah. Let's see, I have another question here. I spoke on the spillover from the settlements on the local population, creating farming and urban areas. Is there a concern that they're being given the best arable lands, shutting out the locals and limiting them so as to prevent large-scale farming and access to loans? Yeah, so that is a methodological concern for me as well, because that would make it more difficult for me to establish causality if the lands are the highest quality lands, then there is a likelihood that the rest of those regions would become agricultural regions as well in the future, like the surrounding areas. The spillovers could be explained by the fact that that's just where the good farming land is. So anyone who wants to do farming is going to go there. Now, what I can say as far as some motivating evidence for why this might not be a huge concern is that, one, so I mentioned that Mennonite settlements tend to, they migrate in large contiguous areas of land. And so this means that there's a requirement that the settlement is a large contiguous plot of land that can be purchased at that time. So that already just eliminates a lot of land, because there's a lot of areas where some of the land is already purchased. And so if you were to buy land there, it would be interspersed with local people. And typically the Mennonite community wants to be one contiguous area that doesn't contain intersections with local populations. And so that's one constraint on the land selection process. And secondly, from some of my reading, definitely from some of Ben Knobs-Thiessen's work, again, I'm citing him again, I've also come to understand that governments will oftentimes try to strategically funnel Mennonites close to borders or regions where they're worried about border disputes in the future, or potential conflicts with other regions. And so they'll kind of end up putting them in those strategic locations so that they can essentially establish a presence in those lands, that would prevent, as countries are kind of starting to establish national boundaries and things, and there's disputes, that would prevent other nations from expanding into those zones. So that's kind of another common constraint that is placed on where the historical Mennonite settlements were located. So those are two things that I think kind of alleviate that concern a little bit.
Thanks, Elena. While I have a question I'm going to ask, but while I'm doing that, can you put up that first slide, so the 70% that someone referred to was a very interesting one. But my question was about 5 years ago or so, there was a big news item in Belize of Mennonites, some Mennonites from a particular group of Mennonites were migrating from Belize to Peru. And the only reason I think it got in the news is because it was during COVID on their return to Belize after scouting. They were held in Mexico for a while, a long time actually. But eventually, over 100 or so Mennonites from that community left Belize and went to Peru to resettle. That was explained, if I recall, as not only concerns about COVID regulations, but also concerns about land availability and land regulations, land use regulations. I don't know if you know about that specific incident, but this sort of movement from one country to the other seems to be also part of the sort of settlement trends of Mennonites over time in Central and South America. How does that in any way sort of enter into your analysis in terms of is there a sort of point of saturation that Belize has reached for Mennonite settlement? Why some people are leaving? Thanks.
Yeah, great question. So a saturation point, that's an interesting way to put that, that I haven't really thought of characterizing it in that way in previously. So yeah, thank you for that thought. We're just writing this down. Okay. And so, but yeah, that really comes down to, I guess what you're getting at is like land scarcity is one piece of it. And then I guess progress or change, sort of policy change or regulation change in the country as the country sort of develops and moves farther away from the point in time where they originally granted particular policies or agreements to the Mennonites. And I pull up this slide here because it kind of shows that this is pulled from the paper that I got. I'm just gonna kind of get rid of that for a second. This paper that I got my data from by Lepolaine de Waro et al. 2021, and that paper keyword term search is called Pious Pioneers, something. But if you want to look up that paper, it's also a really great paper put out by some geographers that provides a big picture of the migration into Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole. And this figure kind of shows how that progressed. And this has happened time and time again, where the current host country, land becomes more expensive, or land becomes scarcer in that country, or the political situation in that country has changed. So originally, what actually led the Mennonites to move from Canada into their first destinations, which were Mexico, you can see this arrow here, 1922, and Paraguay, 1927. We go all the way down here. That was actually around the time of where the Canadian government was trying to crack down because of the World War on Mennonites' privileges to not have to join the military, and also their privilege for being able to speak German in their schools and in their communities. So because of the war, these were sort of two political sort of points of contention, and many Mennonites decided to leave to Mexico for that reason. Now you see again, sort of 30 years later, after they've been established in Mexico for a while, is when they moved from Mexico into Belize. And this continues to occur. That's where you see here, 2017, from Belize to Peru. And so you just have this continuous kind of jumping for many of those reasons. I don't really exploit that in my paper in any way at this point. It's a very interesting phenomenon, but I haven't quite figured out what to do with it or what to make of it. But I do think that there is a sort of point where costs of land become something to reckon with, certainly because having enough land for every family is very important in the culture. And so, everybody should have a plot of land that they can farm. That's one of the beliefs that I've understood and learned from my reading. And so once that becomes too expensive or less available, or the conditions or the beliefs of particular groups change, then you get these op splits, and the search for new frontiers continues.
Thank you for that, Elena. Those numbers of 3% of population being the largest in terms of comparison with the other countries, and 70% of all arable land being farmed by Mennonite communities is indeed, it stands out as quite, I suppose, unique. And the question is, how does that impact Belize negatively or positively? And that's one of the questions you're seeking to answer to some extent. Are there any? There's a question by Emma Sanchez. Please go ahead.
Hello. Good morning still. Thank you very much for your presentation. Unfortunately, I joined a little late and I didn't see the entire thing, but what I saw was very interesting, Elena. So my question probably is not going to be answered today, but I'm happy that somebody makes a take on it. But I come from the conservation world, wildlife research, big cats research, and more than often I've seen these land change, and a lot of times it's been attributed to agriculture expansion. And one of the things that it has been affecting is the habitat for biodiversity, jaguars in this case, in my case that I've studied a lot. And one of the so first of all, so I wanted to zero in on this buffer that you had mentioned that very often happens around settlements, that this buffer that changes to agriculture is I believe it was like 25 kilometers and so why is this happening? Is it deliberate clearing? to increase or enlarge in their settlements? Or is it something related to, let's say, like uncontrolled fires? Like, would it be possible to see that in your model to model that in what you're doing? Because it's very interesting whether it's something deliberate or is it something that in their practices they're not doing fire control, which is a major thing that can go to control, and then you have these land being destroyed and so on and so forth. And then also in your comments and other questions, you also mentioned about more than often government would give land to Mennonite settlements that in places where it's very unlikely that or it's less likely that they're going to have disputes occurring. And a lot of times what I've been confronted with is like we have these land settlements that are near protected areas. And what has happened is, and I believe, I don't know if anyone here has had this issue happening, and we see that they start clearing, and a lot of times it goes beyond the boundary or goes into the boundaries of these protected areas. And because they're so remote, because nobody's around to see it, when we see it, it's already too late. And these things often happen with these Mennonite communities that are far away, and we don't see them every day, for example. So, and then another thing that has, I guess, that has happened is that I've worked also with some communities, and a lot of times it's not only, and they have not only singled out Mennonites agriculture lands, but agriculture in general, that they end up being locked into a space, and they cannot, if the community itself cannot grow because there's no land available, because everything else is owned, and it's agriculture parcels, and so there's this other issue as well that in the rural especially, I've heard several communities indicating that there's no growth, they can't grow nowhere because they don't have any land available because of agriculture.
Okay, no, thanks for that. That's from Emma is from a sister institute at UB, the Environmental Research Institute. So thanks for joining. Elena, I'll let you respond to that before we go to a question from someone at the ISCR, the National Institute of Culture and History. Go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, so thanks for that question. This is exactly what I'm wondering myself. And initially, when I saw my analytical results, I thought, oh, wow, well, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 kilometers, we still see the effect. And the effect actually gets, if anything, as I make my buffer zone larger, my effect of spillovers gets larger, which means that those farther away areas are indeed accounting for some of that effect. And it's not just the zones that are right there on the border, right? So it's like, I was like, this is not just fire jumping the border or clearing going over the border. This is other people who are sort of also adopting agricultural practice or moving to that area to engage in agriculture themselves. Now, since I've been here in Belize, I've learned that and I'll say this also in relation to that 71% number that I gave. And how I got that number is I took the UN FAO's latest total amount of arable land in Belize. And then I take all of the land that I have within Mennonite settlement boundaries, and I count that up as a percentage of the arable land, because I know that the land that is within Mennonite settlements is, for the most part, arable land. And so that's where I get my 71% number from. It's a back of the envelope calculation. But what I've found since I've been here is that there are many other plots of land that are off-site, outside of the Mennonite settlement boundaries, that are owned and being farmed by Mennonites, and in some cases are not owned, but just simply being leased by Mennonites and being used for agricultural production carried out by those but that is a part of the firms that are within the Mennonite settlements. And so that makes it a lot more difficult for me to determine attribution and understand whether this is a structural transformation effect of, say, other people moving into the area and beginning to adopt the agricultural production as their labor sector, or if it's simply Mennonite settlement production that's also occurring on other plots of land. And so one way that would be ideal to actually get more information about this would be to have more comprehensive data on land titles or land transactions, and actually be able to attribute ownership of different land to different people and understand whether it's Mennonite production or not. And even then, it would still, as I understand, that leasing is a big part of this as well. Land titles might not be enough to really understand that. But what the general equilibrium model would do is sort of provide a framework by which we would say, well, it seems theoretically likely that, other people would be moving into this area and adopting agriculture as well, as a result of, observing the Mennonite agricultural practices there. Local Belizeans just move into agriculture too. But if the model actually shows that something like, well, we wouldn't expect that at all, actually, according to the model, we shouldn't expect to see agriculture growing outside of that zone, then that might suggest that it is, more than likely land that's being produced on as part of Mennonite firms rather than outside firms. If there's that uncertainty about who owns or who leases or who's using that land. So it's very tricky.
You have so many angles you can go with this. And Stacy, before going to niche, I'm sure that you can see this seminar indeed as part of your own research, and take some of the comments and the questions as something that could, even though you're almost there, take into consideration for your finishing up. I will now go to someone from the Belize Institute of Social and Cultural Research, Niche.
Hi, good morning. Thank you so much, Elena, for that presentation. And I really love that there's somebody that's doing this type of work. I think that Belizeans are generally not entirely sure how to approach a topic like this. I think it's very sensitive, especially since majority of us are not privy to the old contract that you had stated earlier in your presentation. And at the time, I believe that Belize was trying to move into this period of industrialization through agriculture for a growing population. We were trying to increase the amount of people that were living here, and that's why we initially agreed to this. In that particular contract, though, and I'm not necessarily sure of the phrasing, so please correct me if I'm wrong about this, but there is a statement that this contract is binding for all of their generations to come. And I think that particular line there set a domino effect really into how much these families and these groups would acquire land. And a lot of these groups have moved away from agriculture and have gone into other types of businesses, particularly mechanical, engineering, and industrial, but are still able to utilize that land. And so I'm not sure exactly how that particular clause works in the sense of using just for agriculture or using for other sorts of economic growth. And if that's the case, then are they breaking what is binding for them and for their generations to come? And how are we as Belizeans able to, I guess, use that? I don't want to say to our advantage, but just for us to learn about how this particular contract set the tone for land here in Belize, land leasing, buying, purchasing, outside of like reservation and conservation, like Emma was asking earlier. Thanks.
Yeah, you can go ahead, Elena.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question that, I don't have the answer to, and I think people like Dr. Vernon and those who are kind of more familiar with the policy outlook, and Christopher who asked earlier a question as well, who has spoken to some Mennonites about this. I'm really not sure how this is an open question for me, how this kind of historical agreement is being used today, if it's been, actually disputed in any way, or if there have been any trials, or if there's been any precedent around that. That's really something that I would love to know more about as well. And if there are any other documents or more recent cases where we really have an understanding of, you know, because like as far as I've understood, it's like I thought about it, like even if that agreement is it really doing anything right now? Like what is it that agreement is still doing now? I don't know if, if there really is any of those. There may be some like the taxation thing that's in there, or the exemption from Social Security, like those kinds of things. Like so my question would be like, what are the benefits that are still arising from that, aside from the land that was purchased and that, is still owned by those communities. So yeah, that remains a question for me, and I don't know if anyone in the audience here has any knowledge about that.
Well, one of the things that maybe it's a good time to say share that BelPri is in the early stages of beginning to prepare for some comprehensive research on land tenure and land use in Belize. For one, you'll be hearing more about it later this year. But also, when the PCC report comes out, and Chris, maybe we can take a look at that specific aspect of the PCC report at some point, in the context of land use and agricultural use of land, that we can do a BelPri seminar around it, or a panel discussion, or include it as one of the themes that we have to bring out, the more what's happening with the agreement. Are there new agreements that have been signed that we need to document and analyze and examine? There's a question from John. If farming is the focus for the communities, and the presentation did stress this, is there a way to account for it and its effects into the diversification into other areas of the local economy, housing, solar energy? I suppose the question is asking, is there diversification outside of the Mennonite community, or in the Mennonite community, into other areas of the local economy other than agriculture? Is that something that you're looking at all?
So, I mean, so I guess I don't know if I understand this question, the phrasing of the question exactly, but I think that that is what we want to do is essentially see, okay, like, did this lead to the diversification of the economy in some particular way or not? And that could come out of the general equilibrium modeling. You know, at this point, the empirical results are sort of not showing that because, as I pointed out, I don't see much industrial growth as a result of the settlements. I'm seeing increases in agricultural use and not really in other land uses. So that kind of points to the diversification story not really occurring, but that could be hidden underneath this sort of feedback loop effects that I mentioned that would be able to be understood better from the general equilibrium modeling stuff.
Yeah, we're running out of time here, so we're going to be closing soon, but I'll take two more questions and then ask Elena to if she has any wrap-up comments, and then I will close off. There's Emery Ford. Emery, go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Vernon. Elena, I wanted to just kind of frame, I think, a lot of the questions that have been asked, and I think also the target of your or the objectives of your study. I think when I think about it, I think it's underscoring this recurrent topic or this new topic and debate about industrial policy. And I think the question of or one of the underlying questions of the research is whether or not this particular industrial policy that was undertaken by the Belizean government, whether or not it was successful or not. And I think you attempted to answer that question using a particular economic strategy and approach by looking at the agglomeration benefits related to the land and the spatial characteristics of how the land use change after the inception of the particular policy. And I think the key question that's coming out of it, the key question is whether or not there was any benefit, whether or not the policy achieved its purpose, which according to the agreement that you showed had a dual purpose, which was to increase the production of domestic agricultural products and to increase the export of agricultural products. And I think there is data to support some of this to support whether or not there was a structural change in the economy, right? And to what extent that structural change occurred over time. I think there is lots of evidence about on this matter in terms of how the economy or how the structure of the Belizean economy changed from the post-1950 50s era up until now. If you were just to look at GDP, for instance, and look at the composition of GDP, you'd be able to identify the shift from the 60s on to now about with respect to the transformation that occurred within the primary sector of our economy, And I think the Mennonite community played a very large part in that transformation. And even today, I think there is evidence that some of the now non-traditional products that Belize exports arise from the Mennonite community. And a lot of the food that we eat that's not from subsistence farm, but commercially available, comes from the Mennonite community, food, furniture, etc. So the thing is that just in terms of framing your research, I think, or reframing your research, I think it's really an investigation on whether or not this industrial policy in which Belize gave up land and perhaps our tax revenues, whether or not this was beneficial to Belize in the long run, and whether or not it indeed induced positive structural changes to the economy. So I just thought I'd leave you with those comments because I think it could help reframe the question and perhaps maybe provide a path to answering the original question, which is whether or not there were welfare gains to the broader society. Thanks.
Okay. Elena, I'll allow you to answer that, and I think that will be our last question. There are a couple of comments that in chat that I'll refer to at the end. So if you can go ahead.
Yeah, so just thank you for that that comment, Mr. Ford. That's very helpful, and I just want to thank everybody who attended for your attention and your interest, and for all of your very helpful questions and insights. And special thanks to BelPri and Dr. Vernon for inviting me to speak today. I'm very excited to see where this work goes, and I hope to share it again once I have an update. So thank you, everyone.
Yes, there was one request in the chat, Elena, if your presentation today could be shared through BelPri to individuals on request. I suppose they're referring more to the PowerPoint presentation because I don't think you have a written paper per se for this. I see you shaking your head that it can be. Okay, so BelPri will get something from Elena, and we have a list of participants. Some housekeeping before we leave. Those of you who haven't filled out the RSVP, could you do that? There's a way that you can leave your email there so we can have your emails for future use and future events. Talking about future events, I want to alert you to one of our major activities coming up. This is going to be the launch of a research paper, a comprehensive research paper on the Belizean economy in the 21st century, when and why Belize fell behind and what to do about it. This is going to be presented by Professor Victor Beaumont Thomas, who some of you might know wrote the Economic History of Belize in 2012. So look out for that. It's Tuesday, the 24th of June at 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. at the UB Conference Center. We're asking you to RSVP for this one. It will be live streamed, but we are trying to get as many people there as possible. You'll be hearing more about it. And in closing, let me again thank Elena Stacy for her, as the word I used before, a fascinating presentation on a fascinating topic. We are looking forward to the final result, Elena, and BelPri stands ready to do any more seminars, or importantly, publishing aspects of your work that are of more perhaps relevance to Belize. And also to say that the next seminar that we do have will most likely be one on the People's Constitution Commission and its report and process, a sort of more of a panel discussion. So keep your ears open for that. Having said that, thanks everyone for signing in and for participating so actively in today's seminar. At some point, when you do request the presentation, it will be available on request. Good luck Elena, with your PhD, I'm sure that you will be Dr. Elena Stacy the next time we see you, or before. Thank you so much. We are now closing off the session.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.